I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. We're taking a little break from our Science Fiction Hall of Fame series to welcome an author for an author interview, which is our normal state of affairs around here. I am your host, David Agranoff. I am the author of The Last Night to Kill Nazis. At the end of this interview, I will have some details on my next release and the release party, which will be held in Indiana alongside a solar eclipse. So it's a really fun thing that you can take part in, and I will give you those details here at the end. But we're here to talk with Philip Fracassi, who has written many books, but we're here to talk about his most recent release, Boys in the Valley. And I was lucky enough to get to see Philip introduce this book at Mysterious Galaxy here in San Diego before his crazy book tour, which we're going to probably talk about. But Philip first got on my radar when I read his short story collection, Behold the Void. And in particular, the story Failsafe is one of my favorite horror short stories. I, in fact, believe I gave that story a shout out on the favorite horror short stories panel discussion with Mary Sangiovanni and Laird Barron and Judge Mark Rothenberg. So we will probably talk about Failsafe because it's one of my favorite short stories. But here to talk about Boys in the Valley, Philip Fracassi. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
Hey man, thank you for having me.
And if you guys hear screaming in the background, I got Browns fans living next door. And we are.
I can't imagine they had that much to scream about, unless they're cussing, unless they're angry.
Yeah, well, as a Lions fan this year, you do have a lot to.
As a Lions fan, who finally has a good team, I get to now make fun of other bad teams because I've been making fun of for the last 40 years. So now it's my turn to start ripping another team. I'm very excited about that.
Are you from Michigan? Is that the?
Yeah, I'm from the Detroit area.
Well, I wanted to get your reading and writing origin, so that's a great segue. How did you get into reading and writing horror?
Well, it starts with, I think, what you read, and to your point. So when I was a kid, I gravitated toward horror novels. I gravitated toward Stephen King and Clive Barker. Dean Koontz was a huge gateway drug for me. Like Shadows and Watchers and all those early Koontz titles. When I read The Talisman for the first time, when I read The Shining for the first time, those were such memorable moments for me. And I think I actually started when I was very, very young. I think I was reading more fantasy, but I liked the darkness of the fantasy that I was reading. Like I read, the Chronicles of Narnia, but I also and the Prydian books by Lloyd Alexander, and I think I kind of got into the whole like dark sword and sorcery elements of those books versus the more flowery fairy or aspects. I just liked the kind of the idea. So I didn't know Joe Abercrombie didn't exist then. So so I think that was sort of like a segue, and then I started reading horror and I read a lot of horror and sci-fi when I was young, like most kids. And then I when I was like in elementary school, I was given an assignment to write a short story for the as part of me and every other kid in the class, and I wrote a short story, and I just fell in love with the idea of creating stories and creating worlds and creating characters and making these characters do all this crazy fun stuff and have all these. And I think one of my very earliest stories was a horror story, which was about a roller coaster that never stopped. And I think I was like 12, and but they get, they could never get off the roller coaster, and they all were getting sick, and the people were throwing themselves off. It was like this horrible thing.
That's not a bad concept for a first story.
It was my first story, but it was an early story. Yeah, no, one of my, but yeah, my first horror story for sure. And I think up until then, I was writing like pastiche of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and detective stuff and things like that. I don't know, but I was like, I was like a little kid, so it was whatever. Yeah, and then I started writing more horror. I wrote a novella when I was in 7th grade. I tried to write a couple novels, but couldn't quite. It was frustrating for me when I was younger to try and write novels because I realized, even at that age, that I didn't have enough knowledge to write the novel as a way I wanted to. So I stopped writing. I was very frustrated about that. So as I got older, I kind of kept writing and writing and writing, and then I started doing screenplays, and then about 2015, I started writing professional horror again, and it's been kind of downhill ever since, or downhill in a positive momentum.
Well, uphill for your readers.
It's kind of been in both ways, but it's been, but that's why I started writing horror. Yeah.
Well, and did you have I know for me, it was reading The Raft by Stephen King, where I started to see like, oh, now I know what he's doing. Now I know, I see why he put this here and put that here. Did you have any particular stories or novels that had that impact on you, or
not early on? I mean, I to be honest, no, I didn't really start reading as a writer until I was being published, so I always read for pleasure, and all that stuff just sort of seeped in. It really was, I think I would say this. I would say the first book where I had that kind of feeling was probably when I read The Beautiful Thing That Awaits Us All by Laird Barron. And I think I first read that around I think it was around 2014, which 2014, 2015, by the way, was like a golden moment in like horror history. Like I think Bird Box came out, The Beautiful Thing That Awaits Us All came out, Head Full of Ghosts came out. So that was a kind of an interesting little moment in time.
That's true. Yeah.
And that kind of kicked me into that whole field. But anyway, I think when I was reading A Beautiful Thing That Awaits Us All by Laird Barron, I remember reading that book, and I remember thinking, how is he making me feel this way? What is he doing? The prose, Laird's prose is so unique, and it's such a unique voice, and it's so immersive, and it's so dark, and it's very haunting as a reader. And I remember thinking, I wonder how he's doing this. And that was probably the first time I had that reader to writer connection, where I was trying to figure out, how he was doing what he was doing as a writer while I was reading it.
Yeah.
And now I do it all the time. I can't stop doing it now.
Yeah. Now I find it sometimes like, and I talk about this a lot in my reviews, is that I can't shut off writer brain. So sometimes, like, I know certain things that are a problem for me in a novel might not be a problem for just the general reader. For example, I think Ascension by Nicholas Benji, like when I read that, like the fact that it was all supposed to be epistolary, but then
no spoilers. I haven't read it yet. It's on my TBR.
Okay. Well, it's sometimes when writers break the rules of, when something's epistolary and then it suddenly is not.
Don't get me started on epistolary novels. I hate it. It's like, here's the thing I hate the most about epistolary novels. So you can tell me if I'm gonna hate this book. I hate it when it's all like right. It's like I'm writing this letter from the cave.
You're not gonna like that book.
And then it's like, and now I'm gonna write like 3 pages of word for word dialogue. And it's
exactly
that. Like,
yeah.
No one would ever write that in a letter.
Yeah.
One or the other. If it's a letter, it's got to sound like a letter.
You and I are on the same page, and it's the reason why I grilled that book.
Yeah, you can't do that. It's such a bad thing to do. And like, or in journal entries, and it's like, all my whole book is journal entries, so I'm gonna now write like all this intricate dialogue that there's like with quotes and everything. It's like you would never ever ever do that.
Right,
And
right. Well, and this is one of the reasons why I think Stephen King is the best first person
he
writer
doesn't do
because
it. He's good about it.
yeah, he does not cheat. Dolores
Doesn't cheat.
Claiborne is a perfect example. He never cheats the technique. And I think, it's one I'm not a big fan of first person for that reason because most people cheat. Most writers cheat on
Yeah.
the narrative, but I'm with you right there.
I wrote one epistolary story called The Baby Farmer. I may have written more than one, but the one I'm remembering right now. And the way I did it for any writers listening, is I had the letter or the diary entry. It was Amelia Dyer, who was a real life serial killer, and she killed like 400 babies. And so I had her diary entry, and then I cut to story, and then
Yeah.
I had a diary entry, and then I cut the story. Meaning I wasn't cheating because I was telling the story, but then I was having the diary entry sort of interspersed throughout the story. So I was filling in the blanks that way versus like having it all
Oh,
be in the letter.
there's ways you could fix it. You could introduce the letter at the beginning of a chapter or do ellipses and then go into the story.
Yeah, there's lots of
But
different ways.
yes, there's lots of ways you could do that. All right.
Oh,
Well,
now
hey,
I was really looking forward to Ascension, but I'll still read it. I'm sure it's well. I've heard good things about it, but that is a bugaboo of mine. That's a pet peeve.
yeah, you're gonna have a big bugaboo with that book because I did, and we're on the same page of that. And that's one of the things we like to do on this podcast is get under the hood of books and writing technique and things like that. So it's fine. We'll get to Voice of the Valley in a minute because I definitely want to get under the hood there. And look, no writer's perfect, when they do these things. But if you're gonna choose to write a first person narrative, you got to stick to that. You got to be true to it. And that's one of the reasons why I think King. One of the things he did in like later the recent hard case crime is
Yeah, I loved that.
I love that book too. And the first person narrator gets smarter as they grow up telling the story. And God, that was so well done. And
Yeah, and the writing was a little bit different. Yeah, yeah, and I've had that happen. I've read books like that before where I've been very well. And not to. I mean, that's kind of one of the things that's like one of the things about the Harry Potter books is that's kind of interesting to me as a writer is how the writing developed along with the characters' ages. I thought that was kind of like first book is a children's book, and the last book is basically adult. So I thought it
yeah.
was I thought that was kind of interesting. But yeah, yeah.
And the readers were growing up with those books, so
Yeah,
it makes
right. And the right. So readers who are growing up with them were kind of that was kind of I know she's not a fan. I know she has her issues, but as far as a pure writing thing, I thought that was a fascinating thing about those books, how they evolved as the characters evolved.
So, Philip, you were a road dog for this book. You did a serious book tour.
Yeah.
And that's no undertaking, or no little undertaking for an author because you had to do a lot of that yourself, I'm sure.
I did all of it myself.
All
Yeah.
of it yourself because book tours like that are not paid for by publishers.
No. No.
So, tell me about your experience and what did you learn by hitting the road and meeting readers like that?
Yeah. So, I've had a few books out. As when Boys in the Valley came out this past summer, and I really wanted Boys to do well, and it was my first Big Five release, and so I was kind of like, and I asked the publisher, I said, "Will there be any tour with the release?" And they were like, "No, we don't really do that, especially for first time writers." I think the way publishers generally work is they have the top 1 to 2% get all the marketing and promotion dollars, and then everybody else is sort of fend for themselves. And so I was like, okay. So I was like, oh, how can I do? Because I really wanted to get out, not just to do the tour, but also not just to meet readers, which was a big part of it for sure. But I also wanted to meet booksellers. I wanted to go into the actual bookstores and sign books. So that was kind of the impetus. So what I did was I did a Kickstarter, and I won't get into all the details, but I basically created some product, some unique product that I was sold only through the Kickstarter. I have a very rabid fan base, so that was so they a lot of them contributed to the Kickstarter. I raised like $14,000 of which I netted like 10 after I had to pay for all the stuff I was publishing and the fees and all that stuff. So with that 10 grand, I basically booked a nationwide tour. I think I don't remember how many stops I did. I think it was like 26 stops from LA all the way to Toronto. Which my wife and I drove across the country. And then we went to the UK for 2 weeks. So yeah, that was all. I had to do it all myself. I did all the graphics myself. I did all the bookstore events myself. All the coordination, booking authors to come sit with me and talk with me about the book, promoting the every stop. It was the hotels, the rental cars, the flights. It was a thing. It was quite the endeavor, and I would never do it again. Um,
Yeah, I
but
imagine that
but I'm
that's
glad
like
I
an
did it.
experience.
I'm
Like,
glad I did
did
it
it?
once. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think I would do like if a publisher were to pay me for me to go to like maybe 5 or 6 stores, which is kind of the usual modus
yeah,
operandi with publishers. They usually send their authors to 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different key locations. I would definitely do that. I just don't think I would do the you know 2.5
nationwide thing.
months of straight touring like I did, because it was by the end I was on fumes. I think there were some stretches where I was doing like 6 events back to back, 6 days in a row, and with driving to different cities in between every night. And by the end, I was pretty gassed. But it was cool. It was a lot of fun. I met a lot of great people, and for me, it was all sort of a lost leader, because it really wasn't so much about selling Boys in the Valley. I mean, it was, but it was also a lot about the future books that I
Yeah.
have lined up that I'm writing, and now having those relationships with bookstores and booksellers and readers. So hopefully it's something that will help develop my overall readership and interest from different bookstores across the country and in the United Kingdom, where I spent 2.5 weeks as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure that was just an amazing experience going over there as an author
It was, yeah.
as well. Yeah, and just the chance to build your brand as Philip Fracassi, the author. Now, the people that you saw for Boys in the Valley, and or are people that are going to, from now on, every time a Philip Fracassi book comes out, they're going to have that personal attachment to you, and so it's a very smart thing. And
Yeah. And it
yeah,
was fun. I like meeting. I love doing there's so many other things. I mean, I could talk for an hour about the tour, but it's also like, you get those bookstores that promote the event. Therefore, they're promoting your book, and the people that come are taking pictures and posting it on social media. So there's a lot of positives. But for me, it was really nice to have those one-on-one meetings with readers. Almost, I think almost every stop, I would go out for drinks with a couple readers afterward.
yeah,
So that was really gratifying, and it was nice to meet folks who were fans and be able to have one-on-one time with them.
right. And you never know who's going to be the people that are there. I always tell the story of a lesson that I learned from Clive Barker, which is when Abarat 2 came out, he was doing book events around Southern California, and I drove up from San Diego to Orange County to see Clive Barker do a signing at a store in a mall there. And on my way up, I had a friend that drove me and went up with me. He wasn't a reader, but he just wanted a road trip. And on the way up, I told him, I was like, yeah, there's probably gonna be a line out, throughout the mall, and it's gonna be like this crazy thing. And we showed up, and there were 4 people there.
Yeah,
And I had the experience of being like embarrassed and like, oh God, this is terrible. There's only 4 people here. This is gonna be so disheartening for Clive Barker. And when he showed up like 10, 15 minutes late. But when he showed up, he was so generous and excited and treated the 4 of us that were there like we were royalty.
yeah,
Right. And I learned a big lesson, because I told myself, well, he doesn't care how many people are here. He cares that we're here. And he's making a big deal about it. He's Clive freaking Barker, right?
yeah.
And I shall also remind people that when a year and a half later, I was hanging out with Clive at the Bram Stoker Awards because uh, um, he was there and talking to him, and he remembered, and he said, "Oh, we met in Orange County." And if there had been a whole line of people, he probably wouldn't have remembered.
No, I doubt that. I mean, that's
Yeah,
great because yeah, I know the amount of people that I met, over the 3 months tour, and given how tired I was at most of those stops, like yeah, I'd be hard pressed to remember a lot
yeah,
of faces and names, but you do remember people. That's the thing that was a little bit stressful. I think that added to the stress of the tour. We actually got with a couple exceptions, it was pretty flawless. My wife did all the scheduling and everything, so um, and so she was kind of like playing tour manager. So that everything went pretty seamlessly. But one of the things that was stressful was when you would show up, the half hour before you would go to the event and not
yeah,
knowing what to expect. Will there be nobody there? Will there be 40 people there? And that was kind of that anxiety was not because I was so worried about me, to your point. It was more like I didn't want the store to feel like, oh, this guy's, you know, not going to draw off readers. We're never going to have him here again, or we're never going to sell his books again, or whatever. So I was kind of like nervous about that. Um, and I would say that, but 90% of the stores we had a great showing where at least 10 people showed up. But I probably had 5 or 6 stores where we had 40 or more. And then I probably had 5 or 6 stores where there were like 3 or 4 people. So it was surprisingly the big cities tended to be the least turnout.
yeah,
New York was kind of not many people showed up in New York. Uh, we talked about San Diego. Not a lot of people showed up in San Diego. Um, but then when I would do I went to like a little an indie store in I went to a bunch like in Kentucky or Arkansas or Tulsa, and I would have 20, 30 people there. So it was interesting to do that and to see what the different turnout was like.
yeah. That being said, there are, uh, for example, I did a book event in Victoria, Canada that one person showed up to. And Des has become one of my really, really good friends, the one person
Yeah,
who showed up.
yeah,
And become somebody that he's become a trusted reader. And I was the first guest on his podcast that now has 800 episodes. And that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been there. And
for sure.
for example, too, yeah, we didn't have a great turnout here in San Diego, which I wasn't going to mention, but I was there and
It's
I was
okay.
very excited to be there.
Right.
However,
Yeah.
one thing that did come out of it is that Boys in the Valley has been consistently in the staff picks at Mysterious Galaxy after that.
Yeah.
And Rob, for example, is one of the people who pushes your book constantly. I've been at other events and I've seen it front and center on tables, and that personal connection is one of the things that can't be undervalued.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's what I meant by meeting booksellers. That's what was so great. One of the great things about doing the tour was like going to all these bookstores and meeting the booksellers face to face and talking to them about the book and they would that I'd go to these stores where I'd never been before and they would roll in a cart with 40 copies of the book and I would sign every one of them. And so
Yeah,
even if a lot of people didn't show up, I signed whatever stock they had at almost every single store. And most of the stores had a pretty big stock. So I went to a couple of stores where they didn't pre-buy a lot of books. And ironically, tragically, a lot of people would show up. Like I had I think I had 2 stops where we sold out in and there were people who didn't have enough books for the people that were there. That was kind of a drag.
yeah,
Um, but
yeah.
um,
That
but it
happens.
happens. You never know. Yeah. And then I had bookstores where they had 50 copies and 6 people showed up. So it's not an exact science,
Nope.
but it was yeah. I don't know. That's why I say you just like. And I've
Okay.
spoken to other authors since and during, and there's more strategic ways you can do it, and you can kind of but this was me doing it on my own, like I said, so it was really just like literally just like hitting the road and hoping for the best.
Yeah, I remember the first time I saw your post with your dates, and I was like, damn, he's really going for it. And I was really impressed that, and I thought to myself, you know, what it showed me, and one of the things is I know Boys had a smaller limited release, but one of the things for me was that when I saw how committed you were to touring for it, I was like, I made a mental note like that's a book that I'm going to make sure. I was like, this author really believes in this book. And that was something too that I took note of. And, it didn't hurt that, you were in conversation with Cody, who I certainly respect and,
Yeah.
wanted to see that. One question though, before we get one non Boys in the Valley question, and then we'll go hard on
Yeah.
Boys in the Valley. Um, uh, Failsafe, your short story. People can read it online. It was on Nightmare Magazine, so they can find it online. Uh, it's funny, like that to me was the one where I liked a lot of the stories of Behold the Void. But for whatever reason, that was the story that I was like, okay, this guy knows what he's doing. That story impacted me. I'm wondering from your perspective if you hear me saying that, because I've had people say like this story or this novel of yours fits for, and sometimes it's not the one you expect. How did What's your reaction to me saying that Failsafe is the story that just really that announced Philip Fracassi for me as
Well,
a guy that I
yeah.
wanted to continue to follow?
No, everyone has their, I'm a lot of the thing with me and my writing, which can frustrate people, but also I can't really do anything about it. Is what it is that all my novels, all my stories are kind of unique. And my novels are all and my novels specifically are all very different from each other because I like writing, not only do I like writing different stories, but I like writing them in different ways. I like using different tone. I like having, I don't know. I like writing the story I want to write, and it's not always the same story. I know there's a lot of authors who make a lot of money by cranking out the same kind of like it's kind of the same book over and over and over again, but like with different trope attached to it or a different twist. I'm more of like I want every book to be sort of unique in its own sort of thing. So I do have a lot of people who are like, I love this book, I didn't really like this book, or I like this story, I didn't really like this story. So it doesn't bother me. I'm glad that somebody has a favorite anything. But but Failsafe is an interesting story to pick because um I wrote that story. So when I sold a collection to Journal Stone back in the day, I wanted to write a couple. I wanted to write a couple original stories for the collection. So Failsafe was one of the stories I wrote for the collection, and then I tried to sell that story. Actually, let me back up. I tried to sell that story, and I sent that story to, I think it was something like 16 different publishers, magazines, anthologies, and every single one of them, turned it down, rejected it. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to put it in this collection. But I want, like I said, I wanted to have some original stuff in there. So that one had never been published. But I was like, I really believe in this story. So I want it to be in this. I want it to be in the collection, even though I'm basically being told by all these people that the story is no good. Um, I really believe in this story, and so I put it in the collection, and and then it was Nightmare Magazine reprinted it. It was in Best Horror of the Year, Volume 10, Ellen Datlow anthology series, and it's been, I think, reprinted in German and it's in Italian. So it's like it's kind of I said, maybe aside from Alter, probably my most successful story in that sense. And then it's also I optioned it to a major film studio and a
Yeah.
major producer, and a big time writer director. So that's so it's in, I wouldn't say it's in development, but they optioned it and they wrote a script and they're thinking about it. So hopefully it gets made into a movie. So it's been a very successful story for me, but it was a story that was a lot of people didn't want, and so it's always nice to hear that it's a story that you enjoyed.
Well,
It's
and
kind of a.
what I'll
I'll
say
say one
about it
last thing.
is,
I want to
oh,
say
go
one last
ahead.
thing about that story. That story was written sometimes a lot of my stories are written in response to things. And when I'll explain that. What I mean by that is, so Failsafe was written in response to, at the time, this is probably 2016, there was a lot of blowback about ambiguous endings in horror stories, and it was kind of like a thing at that time. It was everyone we're always the horror community and the horror readers were always complaining about something, and in 2016 they were complaining about too much ambiguity in horror stories. And so I wanted to write a story that was basically a response to, like, it was almost me saying like, oh, I'll show you ambiguity. I'll show you a
Right.
story that you were not only do you not 100% know how it ends, but the endings are infinite. And that's kind of what the impetus for that story was.
Well, and one of the things I feel about it is there were probably weirder stories. There may be stories that were better written in the collection, maybe. But what attracted me to Failsafe was that it felt like a traditional horror story. And it's funny that you mentioned the ambiguity thing, because even though I see what you're saying about trying to go for ambiguity, what I like about it is that it connected with me in a sense where I felt I very much understood what you were trying to do with the story. And sometimes I don't, even if it's ambiguous, if I know what you're trying to do, I feel like I'm in good hands. And so I don't like with writers when things feel like a mess, or I don't know where they're going, or don't know what they're doing. And what I think with Failsafe, I was like, it felt very tuned to, I know what I'm trying to do with this story, and I'm gonna pull it off, and I'm gonna do it. And I just felt like the story worked. So that's one of the reasons why it worked for me.
Yeah, there are stories, there are, you mentioned earlier about reading for as a writer with the writer brain. And so, and to your point, there's a lot of times I'm reading a book and my writer brain kicks in and I'm like, this writer doesn't know what they're going to do next. And so they're like biding time. They're they're dog paddling, and it drives me a little bit nuts because I'm a big outliner, and I don't mind people who are pantsers. As a matter of fact, very successful, blah blah blah. A lot of people are very successful pantsers, who don't know where the story's going to go next. But if you don't know where this, don't that doesn't mean just write and write and write and write and write until you figure it out. Like, stop, know what you're doing. So Failsafe is a very tight, what I would consider a very tight story. Some of my stories are not very tight. Like I wrote a novel called Saculina where I really take my time building up the characters, and I kind of, and I really kind of like, it's a more of a pace. The pace is much different. It's much more of a, we're going on a kind of a journey together here. Failsafe is very much like a Twilight Zone episode. It's written very in a way that's like, there's no fat. It's just like, and this happens and this happens and this happens and this happens. And the POV of the, it's told from the perspective of the kid. No, that's not a spoiler.
Yeah.
Is something that I felt very strongly about. I'll tell you this, one thing that you might interest you is, when I first wrote that story, I wrote it because I know you said you don't like first person stories.
Yeah.
When I first wrote that story, I did write it in third person, and I didn't think it was impactful enough. I didn't think the connection with the character telling the story was strong enough. So I actually rewrote that entire story in first person, and I think that really perfected it. I think that
Well,
was what made it
yeah. And I'm
resonate.
not a huge fan of first person. I very rarely write. I almost always write in third person. But if it's done well, I'll forget about it. You know, I'll lose myself in the book.
Well, I'm
And
very curious to hear what you think about Boys in the Valley now,
yeah, well,
with the play on perspectives that happen in that book.
I think I think I talked about that more in the review than I did in my notes for this. But um, and I'd have to look back at that. But I do think that the play perspective. I do think it. I did say it took me a while to get used to it. As a matter of fact, yes, I remember now in my review of Boys in the Valley, I said that that was hard for me early, and
Yeah,
and then I lost myself on it. So I do remember
that's because
saying
you get your writer brain going. Wait, what is he doing? He just
exactly.
went
Well,
from
it's
he just
funny
went from
because
third to first. What is he doing?
right, and you should know that I had a conversation when we were Cody and I were tabling at the heavy metal swap meet a while back, and I told him that one of the things that I really enjoyed about listening to you talk about writing, one of the reasons why I think you're writing works for me is every time you talk about doing narrative or nuts and bolts of narrative or research or whatever, I always agree with it. And for the most part. And like I'm not, that doesn't always happen for me. And I am an outliner too. I I think that outlining is one of the ways we don't end up with under the domes. And I personally think King, for example, is best when he has a cooked in ending, like Misery or The Dead Zone. And I'm just being honest about that. The man is a genius.
Yeah.
I'm not messing with that. But as a writer, I just feel like a plan and knowing where you're going is important. Now, Boys in
Yeah.
the Valley, before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, let's just sell it for anyone who hasn't read it. If you've made it this far and you don't know about the book, let's just talk generally about the inspiration and what Boys in the Valley is about.
Do you want me to talk about the inspiration and what it's about?
Yeah.
Yeah. uh, well, so okay, so it actually ties into what we were just talking about, which was, I think one of the reasons that I am an outliner is because I have a background in screenwriting. I've produced movies that I've written have been produced by Disney and Lifetime, and so I've written a lot of scripts, and that was a big part of my life, and I still write scripts on occasion when I'm paid. I don't do it for free anymore. Um, but the point of that is that Boys in the Valley was originally a script, and so the story was fully fleshed out when I started writing the novel. So to go back to what the story is about, when I was writing the script, or when I was prepping to write the script, I had a meeting coming up with a horror producer, uh, um, and I had 3 or 4 ideas, and I wanted to have like 3 or 4 more ideas in my back pocket for this meeting. And so I was just researching ideas, and I came across this story about an orphanage in Pennsylvania at the turn of the 20th century, where like half of the kids in the orphanage had mysteriously disappeared, and there was never any explanation as to what exactly happened to them. The orphanage was shut down. The remaining kids were sent to factories or other orphanages or whatever they did back in 1900. And I thought that was really interesting, and I wanted to kind of tell the story of what I thought happened to that orphanage in 1905 or whatever. So that was the idea for what that spurred the idea for the book. And what the book is about is this boys' orphanage run by a Catholic priest in rural Pennsylvania. They're far away from, they're hours away from any other city or major town, so they're kind of self-contained. There's 30 boys, and then one night, late night, there's a knock on the door, and it's the sheriff from the town 2.5 hours horse ride away with a couple deputies and his prisoner, and the prisoner is dying, and they want one of the priests, who was a Civil War surgeon, to try and save his life. And from that point on, there's like an evil released in the orphanage. Some of the kids become infested with this evil, some of the kids do not, and it turns into basically a sort of, and then a storm hits, really sealing them all in, and it basically turns into sort of a hot box of horror, Lord of Flies style. And I think that the tagline in the book is Lord of Flies meets The Exorcist, and that's a pretty good summation of what it's about.
Right. And I did not know that you wrote it as a screenplay first. That makes sense. It would make an excellent movie.
It has since been written as a screenplay by another writer director. It's been optioned for a film, so we'll see if that pans out. But it's kind of ironic that I went from screenplay to book to screenplay. But yeah,
yeah, that happens.
ironic might not be the right word. I don't know.
Yeah, I've used the same method. A couple of my books started as screenplays first, and I think that can be a really good part of the process. So for people, if you made it this far, I want us to feel free that we can do spoilers at this point. Like, that's my listen, if that doesn't sell you on the book, it should totally sell you on the book. Let me just tell you that this is a really good year for me reading, and it made my top 10 reads of the year. Spoiler for my podcast, my yearly podcast of top 10 reads. So it's in the I don't remember where it is the position of the top 10, but this was a very strong year.
I'm just glad to be at the party, man.
Yeah. Um, this year I do there were two science fiction novels that absolutely walloped me this year, and that I will give away that one of those was M.R. Carey, Mike Carey, who was recently on the show. So I gave away that that's either going to be one or two.
What was the
The,
name of that? I have that book. He just
the Infinity
remember
Gate by
what was it?
M.R.
What is
Carey.
it? I talked over you. What is it?
Infinity Gate by
Infinity Gate. Yes, yes, yes. And
yeah.
it's gonna be a trilogy. I know the second one's been enough.
Nope, just two, just two.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Oh, cool. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know Orbit, who published that, is publishing my science fiction novel in January of 2025 called The Third Rule of Time Travel. So,
Yeah.
um,
And that was the last interview before you is Mike Carey and talking about that book. And that book just knocked my socks off.
yeah, I
And
can't wait to read it. I'm a
and
big fan of his.
yeah, yeah. And I just recently also he sent me a copy of the new Felix Castor novella, Ghost and Bone, which is very good too.
Yeah,
I,
he's an interesting guy that he does horror and science fiction, and I think I would like to do more science fiction as well. I enjoyed writing the one that I wrote, and Orbit picked it
I
up. So
am
that
very excited for you to write science fiction, Philip.
yeah,
And I've heard about this book because you talked about it in Mysterious Galaxy. Do you want to give people a little preview on that before we dive into the spoilers on Boys in the Valley?
yeah. Well, it's a time travel thriller, and I think I don't want to say it's layman's hard science. We'll call it that. Which is,
Yeah,
but the time travel is unique. I don't think it's ever been done before, and it is actually based in real. This is it's a story. It's based in real theoretical science. But what that means is it's based in actual real science that is still not proven. So, but yeah, so it's a time travel thriller. It's very heart wrenching. Um, but it's a lot of fun, and the folks who have read it have really enjoyed it, and Orbit loved it, so they were very excited to pick it up. And yeah, it comes out
nice.
in January of 2025, so that'll be so the third rule of time travel. So that's the my first science fiction book. And this before that one comes out, I have a story collection called No One Is Safe coming out in April, and then I have a horror novel that I just announced called Serafina that's coming out in August from Earthling, and then the time travel novel January 25.
All right, all right. So now you've got a spoiler warning. We're going to get into details of the story of Boys in the Valley from here on out. And I did notice that in my notes, I did have a question about the switching from first to third.
Just
And
let's just the only thing I ask is I don't mind spoilers, but let's not spoil the ending. We not spoil the ending,
okay, okay,
just in case. Someone's
yeah,
like, "Well, I want to hear, but I still want to reread the." Is that okay with you?
yeah,
We
that's
not
fine
spoil
with
the.
me. I
Okay.
won't give
Everything
away
else is up for grabs.
I won't give away the very ending.
Just the
Yeah,
last chapter.
you know, it's funny because when John Shirley came on recently to talk about Suborbital 7, and I told him spoiler warning and all that, and he was the same. He was like, "I'm not talking about the last the last act of the book, no matter what." And and I get that. I understand that. So
Yeah, I want people to have that experience. That's what everything else we can go for it.
okay, we're mostly going to be talking about the writing process. So
Okay.
okay, so switching from first to third, what was the now? I know I said in my review that when I was first reading it, writer brain like kind of rejected and was like, wait, we were first, we were third here. What are we doing? And then I completely forgot about it once I got engrossed in the story, and that's the way it should be, right? But I also think that your average reader isn't even going to notice that. That's a writer reading that, right? So what was the thinking behind doing this? This was obviously intentional. You made this decision intentionally. So what was the thinking?
Yeah, very intentional. So the thinking was, so the story is told from five different perspectives. and 4 of those are limited POVs told in written in the third person. And what I really wanted was the only 2 parts of the book that are not told from these 5 perspectives is the first chapter and the last chapter. But what I really wanted was for Peter's POV. Peter is the hero of the story, not the hero of the story. He's the kind of like he's the traditional hero character in the story. You could make an argument that there are other heroes, David, or even Brother Johnson to a degree. But I really wanted Peter's POV to be first person, and I had multiple reasons for that. The biggest reason for that, though, was I wanted the reader to really connect with his voice. I know that he is, his character is a little bit, he's not the most complicated character. He's not the most conflicted. I mean, he is pretty conflicted, but he's not, he's a character that has some flaws, as most of my characters do, if not all of them. But I really wanted the reader to feel like when they read Peter's chapters, that they were kind of like settling into his world and kind of seeing things from behind his eyes. Whereas where with the other chapters, you're kind of seeing it on a movie screen, or from a step away perspective. So I really wanted you to be more immersed with Peter, so that he was the one who was sort of like guiding you through the story. And whether you like it or not, or whether you know it or not, by the time you get into the story, by the time you're 50 or 60 pages into the book, you are kind of Peter, and as a reader, and you're going through everything that he's going through. And I think that it makes the book much more emotional, and I think it makes it much more, much more empathy for what he's dealing with. And I think ultimately it makes it a more satisfying reading experience, and I think hits in a different way than maybe it would if it was just all told to you as if it was a movie. I think a lot of readers get really tied in emotionally to the book. So by the time the whole thing's over, hopefully it's something that they're feeling and will hopefully resonate with them for a longer time.
Well, that's interesting too, because if you think about all the time, like rules are meant to be broken, right? I think about Holly, the most recent Stephen King book. He does a lot of telling in that book, and the first rule you're told all the time is show don't tell. And there's actually parts of Holly where he's actually telling what's happening outside of the characters around them, and I think he's just playing with new things, right?
Yeah.
Like to tell a story. And I didn't necessarily like all those things that he was doing, and they made me uncomfortable with writer brain, but I appreciated that he was doing it. And what I like that you're doing here is that you're just trying to hook people emotionally into the characters,
Right.
and what you're doing effectively is tying us into the emotions of the characters. So then you're right, by 50, 60 pages, I forgot about it completely. I wasn't paying attention anymore. I wasn't thinking like, oh, this is a first person chapter or this is a third person. I wasn't thinking about that. I was just thinking about what was going on,
Right.
because I think the movie in my head was starting to play and the story was
But also the thing but when you read those Peter chapters, it was much more his voice
right.
versus all the other chapters, which were my voice, really. But yeah, so I think it just kind of, yeah, I don't know. It
Do you
was
see it
something that
as
I
that you
decided to
were
do.
kind of blending it in or trying to blur the lines between where those narratives started and finished? Because it's hard for me to say, because like I said, I lost track of it,
Yeah,
which is the
I'm
point,
not a
right?
big fan of, like retelling the same information from a different perspective. I like to keep things moving, chronologically forward. So yeah, so I tried to, when I would switch from different POVs, the hope, at least I don't think I did this, but the hope was that I was always kind of like building on what had just happened, even though now we're seeing it from a different perspective.
Right. And the characters in this story, whether you're talking about Father Poole and and some of the different priests and the kids in the orphanage, they all come from very different perspectives. So when you're switching POV, a lot of times, like how they're viewing the events become, part of how you tell the narrative, and the way it shifts back and forth is very well done in this book, as far as you know that goes. So no, before we get into like the differences in how the characters see those things, tell me about the historical research and how it affected the narrative. Because I'm a research nerd too. I just wrote a historical horror novel, or just released one recently, so I know what it means to like research the history and have it inform a story. So what are some key ways that doing the research inform the narrative?
Well, I'm actually more of a, you know, for me when I do a period piece, and I also just wrote a historical horror novel, the one that's coming out from Earthling. It's called Seraphina. The whole novel takes place during the American Civil War, and it was exhausting to write it because there was so much information that I needed to learn and study and research, to get the story right. I mean, but the story definitely comes first. So for me, it's the story is this, and what information do I need to insert into the story so that it's believable, and but without necessarily like doing a history lesson or whatever, or over explaining things that are happening during that period of time because I researched it, so therefore it's in the book. I'm much more about, um what do I to your point, what do I need to put into this story to, from a historical perspective, to inform the story and also to make the story richer, but without overdoing it. And so I think for Boys in the Valley, it was actually pretty limited because the whole book is set in basically one building, um, in the middle of nowhere. I didn't really have to get too expansive on my research. I was basically focused on how would these kids be talking, what would their dialogue be like realistically, what were the conditions like, um, in this kind of situation. But everything, all the research I did was focused on this very isolated thing. I didn't have to do a lot of wide ranging flora and fauna of, Eastern Pennsylvania in 1905. It was really focused um, on the boys. What would they be wearing? Like very specific things. How do they go to the restroom? How do they wash their hands?
Hey, now the
That
corn
kind of stuff.
cob thing
The
is
corn cob,
something that I will take with me for the rest of all time.
right?
That I learned from Boys in the Valley. Either I'm not sure if it was the book or you talking about
I think I brought it up at that mysterious galaxy event. Corn cob. Yeah.
the corn cob thing, like that for wiping the butt. I've now taught that to other people as well too.
Yeah, even I was like, yeah, because I was kind of like, how did they do it? And so there you go. And yeah, whereas like in Serafina, for example, it was so much more research because these three brothers are at the Civil War, and then they're like walking across the country, basically trying to get home. So so there's politics, and there's when I say politics, I mean government, what the government was like, and what police were like, and or what law was like, and what there were no police, but you know what I'm saying, and what the war was like, and what the Mississippi River was like, and what the trees were like, and it was just like it was a lot. Whereas, like I said, Boys was much more isolated from a research perspective, so I didn't really have to do a ton of research. It was more kind of as needed. Whereas when I wrote my novella Shiloh, also a Civil War story, or when I wrote Seraphina, I had to really spend a lot of time researching before I even started the story.
I tried a new trick with Last Night to Kill Nazis, where when I was outlining the book, I made a list with each chapter of things that I thought I'm gonna have to look up. Like for example, like I knew there was a scene where they went through Munich and there's a U.S. Army checkpoint, and I was like, all right, so I need to know U.S. Army slang for the time. And
Yeah.
for example, because they're gonna ask the soldiers for food, And I knew in my head, well, they called it shit on a shingle, like usually like there. But if I know that, then there's going to be all kinds of other slang. So I got to learn that. And then I would just make a list with each chapter. And then a lot of times, um, I would double check that list before I started writing for that day and say, do I need to review this? Because I'd done all the research beforehand, but then a lot of times I would, keep whatever materials I was doing for that chapter and I would say, all right, I got to review slang today, or I've got to review, this chapter is about Hitler's speech secretary. So now I got to read a bunch of his speeches and that's going to be really heavy and suck.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
did that here. But it seems like what you're saying with for boys is that because of the one location, it made it a little bit easier to do the research.
Yeah, it was very isolated. It was a very isolated story. Yeah, it's when you start getting like you're talking about, that's a lot of expansive universe that you have to know a lot of information
Which you
about.
had to do more for Shiloh, right?
Yeah, and it's also surprised that it's also, you said you pre-plan what you have to research by, like I know I don't know if you use Scrivener for outlining. I use Scrivener
Uh-huh.
for outlining, but so I put a lot of that stuff in there as well, photos and that kind of thing. And but it's also surprising how much stuff comes up when you're writing.
Yeah.
Um, that you can't that you don't think about ahead of time, because like something will happen in a scene and you'll be like, wait a minute, what kind of gun would he be using, or how's he loading it, or where would they store their ammo, or what, like I think in Shiloh there was a scene where the guy had been shot, so they ripped his shirt off, and I was like, what would they be wearing under their uniform? What was the underwear of that time? And it's little things like that. And so and what were they, and to your point, slang, you want to kind of use sparingly, but when it's appropriate. And yeah, so it's historical stuff is a lot of research, and you want to get it right as much as you can, because if you don't get it right, you'll hear about it. And so I try my best
Possibly
to,
from Cody.
huh?
And possibly from Cody, you'll hear about it.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I was going to say is, the other thing that's kind of is difficult about writing historical fiction is, it's not just what they're saying or what they're doing, it's not just what the characters or the action, it's also your prose. Like you can't say, you know whatever, like, it hit him like a jolt of electricity if your story takes place in before electricity. Or, and I made a mistake in Boys, I'm not going to tell anybody what it is, that I have to have fixed in the paperback edition after I went through like 6 proofreaders, and after I'd read it 400 times. There's still one thing slipped through, not in anything that happens in the story. Um, it's something that I wrote as prose. So,
Yeah.
things like that, little things like in Serafina, for example, um, they talk about, um, you know, they didn't know about um, blood poisoning from a bullet wound, or infection, so like just the way they, so like I don't know, just you have to be very careful as to how you describe things, what metaphors you use, and all that kind of stuff, because again, everything has got to be that time period, not just what's
Yeah.
happening, visually, or with the characters and the setting and scene. Also, with the way you're describing things, metaphors you use, all that kind of stuff. You have to be very, very careful about what you say.
Yeah, one of my biggest pet peeves in science fiction is when somebody says "in the world," when they're like in Star Trek and they say, he's my favorite person in the world, and it's
No,
like the world doesn't mean shit to these people. It's only
no,
one
no.
world.
Galaxy.
Hold on 1 second. I'm getting blinded by sunlight. Um, so the religious horror aspect of this and the possession part of the story, how is it getting into that aspect of it? I don't know. I have no idea if you're a religious person or not, or what possession stories. I know, like for example, Sadie Hartman, Mother Horror, she's talked about how this book freaked the hell out of her because possession stories mean a lot to her. I personally am not a super religious person, so it's funny because like end of the world stories and intense isolation are like personal things for me that really hit home. And what was interesting for me is Boys in the Valley worked for me, even though like possession stories aren't particularly my favorite horror genre. But what worked for me was the isolation of the orphanage, right? That's what worked for me really intensely. And the idea that Boys worked for me on a lot of levels because I kind of imagined like what it would be like if, these people thought this was happening to these boys. And there's that interpretation of it too, right? So how
Yeah.
did you feel approaching the religious and possession parts of it?
So, I mean, yeah, if you're going to write a novel about possession, you're going to have religion. So, and it's been, I have to be very careful what I say. It's been, I'll say this.
Right.
It's been interesting to me, the response to the religion element of the book, because it is a story about demonic possession. It does take place in a Catholic orphanage. There's going to be some religion in there. I mean, so, but my approach was twofold to answer your question. I want to answer two things that you brought up. The first thing is my approach was always, look, everything I do is to serve the story. Everything I write, whether it's religious or whether it's historical or whether it's the way the prose moves or the pacing, everything serves the story. Every single thing is for the story. So the story needed to have some religion in it to make it work because of the setting and because of the fact that it is a possession story. And so my approach to the religious part was, how can I use this as a tool to make the story better? And so it's just something that I use as it's just a plot device.
Which
It's not.
leads to one of my favorite parts of the book.
Yeah.
And I will also quote Peter Straub had that saying where he said, I don't believe in ghosts, but my imagination does, which I that was great.
Right. Right.
But this leads to the Father Poole refusing to give last rites scene.
Right.
To me, this is one of the most powerful parts of the book. This really creeped me out. Not
Yeah.
because like I care. I'm not a person that's like, oh, this person has to have last rites. So that this has to happen or their soul will go to hell. It's because of the intolerance that he shows in that
Right.
moment. And it's just a powerful scene. You want to tell me about that scene and
Well,
writing?
yeah, and that's part of it too, is like, so yeah, that scene in particular is one of the kids dies. This is not a spoiler, folks. Trust me when I tell you that. And Father Poole, who runs the orphanage with an iron hand, as it were, an iron fist, he um, he tells the other kids that he won't, the child who died won't be buried in sacred ground um, because well, we're doing spoilers, because his take on it is that it was a suicide and therefore a sin. Um, and it's tragic because the innocent child who died, obviously, it wasn't a suicide, and the fact that he would basically be, you know, not given this right that he personally believed in, and that a lot of the kids personally believed in, was very much it was just kind of it was a very savage, mean, like it was an element of cruelty that he hadn't shown really to that point. And you could tell by that point in the story that Father Poole was unspot, he was spiraling a little bit. Like, Father Poole's an interesting character because he starts strict from the beginning, from the get-go, and he has some very strict disciplinary things that he does. But by the end of the book, he's kind of, his arc is that he kind of gets, madness sort of creeps into his world because of what's happening. So that was that scene. And you made the point about um you, you know there's a lot of is it really demon possession is a question that you could legitimately ask after reading this book. Is it really the power of God that helps the kids? Is that really the power of God in this book? And I feel like, and it's interesting to me because there are readers who are passionately angry about the idea of it being sort of evil versus like versus God or holy, religion, blah blah blah, and religion sort of winning. Which, by the way, that's not a spoiler because I'm not saying I don't know you can even say that, but
Right.
and not really taking the time to read sort of a lot of the subcontext or the that I put into the book, whereas it's really about Peter. It's his belief in himself that empowers him to do the things that he does to help the kids, and people are just so ready to be angry about religion that they don't even bother to really read the book carefully enough to realize that that's what the book that's what it's about. So to answer your question about religion, so the long-winded way to answer it is there's definitely religious plot elements in the book. I don't see it as a good versus evil book. I don't see it as a demonic possession versus the power of Jesus book. I see it very much as the manifestation of evil could be coming from demons. It could be coming from some other kind of source of evil we can't define. It could be coming from the conditions that the children were forced to live in. It could be coming from the priests who tortured and abused these kids, and it could be coming from the fact that they had lived lives where they were on the cusp of starvation every day and had to work to eat, work in the fields to even to put food on their table, and had these horrible disciplinary conditions, and that could be the evil. And I think in a lot of ways, and then I think that what the conflict is more about the difficulty of their lives being manifested into violence versus the difficulty of other kids' lives, the other half, if you will, being manifested into goodness. And I think that's what the clash is, and I think that's one of the reasons David's character is very interesting, because David really struggles with what to do every step of the way, because he's very much hates it. He very much hates this orphanage. He hates these priests. It's his hell. He says it's actually a line in the book. That was my hell. And but he still does the right thing over and over and over again, because he believes inherently in goodness and in helping those who need help. So it's very complicated, and I don't like when it's overly simplified as a good versus evil thing.
Right. Well,
but that was the idea when I wrote it.
Well, and I'm gonna explain why I think Boys in the Valley is elevated horror in the and even though I kind of laugh and chuckle at that concept of elevated versus what not elevated horror, like we think of the horror genre is always has the potential to do these wonderful things. To me, now here's the thing that the people who listen to my podcast, whether it's this one or my Philip K. Dick one, know that I say all the time, to me, the fundamentals of storytelling are parallels and reversals. I love when stories use parallels and reversals all the time. And the parallels in Boys in the Valley are so great between the corruption of the boys via, you could, and you just laid this out beautifully. Whether it's the corruption of the boys from the priests, the natural environment, or what's going on, these three parallel tracks are what makes the third act of this book just feel so tight, because the corruption is on many levels, and we know that for something to be truly, for the boys to be kind of confronted or put in this evil situation, it comes from all these things. And it's one of the reasons why the book is so strong, because you have all these horrifying moments, and for me, like I said, the reason why that scene where they're refusing to give the last rites, it's to me, it's the moment where you're in the hands of this religious intolerance and you're trapped there. And these boys are trapped there, and well, things get worse and worse. It's like it's the train wreck coming. It's one of those things. Also, I will have to say now, if you don't want me to go there, I think there is one particular description you have of the experience of demonic possession that I think was a really incredible prose, and I highlighted it in my review. One moment, his head bursting with the swarm, an infinite number of angry flies battering inside his skull, countless black legs pressing against the back of his eyes, crawling through the deepest reaches of his ear canals, climbing up the back of his throat, so loud, so dead, so heavy, he could do nothing, think nothing, but for the instructions. The command to kill is simple, direct. He wants nothing more to comply. Sir, that is excellent.
Yeah, that was me describing how it feels to be possessed.
Great, because here's the thing. As somebody who said that demonic possession didn't really freak me out, that freaked me out. That idea that it made me, it invoked my favorite horror novel of all time in a strange way, which is my favorite horror novel of all time is Wet Bones by John Shirley. And that book,
Wet Bones?
Wet Bones by John Shirley.
Wet Bones, okay.
Yeah. And that book is about addiction. And John wrote it when he was trying to kick heroin addiction. And he's been very vocal and open about it. And one of the things that that book does is explains how hard it is when addiction is controlling you and making you feel powerless to this monster that's inside you. And this moment reminded me of Wet Bones. It reminded me of my favorite horror novel. So that is no little feat.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that I felt the same way when I read Wet Bones, where I felt John's inability to control addiction. This moment, why I think it's such a great moment, is that it made the terror of demonic possession feel very real to me, because it felt like no matter what this kid did, the control was gone and you made it palatable. So hats off.
No, thanks. Yeah, and just so it doesn't seem like I'm contradicting myself, could you make the argument that demon possession is very much what's happening here? Yes. Could you make the argument that there is no demon possession? Yes. There's not a lot of supernatural stuff in this book. As a matter of fact, when I first wrote the screenplay, it was a lot more like straight down the middle, demon possession, supernatural stuff happening. And I was showing it to a director friend, and he said, this would really be more scary if you didn't really know for sure if they were possessed or not. And that comment really, really stuck with me. And I actually, when I wrote the book, I completely wrote it under that umbrella of like, I really want it to be about these characters, the conditions, their lives, the hardships of their lives, and even the scene you're describing, which I think is Brother Johnson character, if I remember correctly, is, I go back into his life and how he got to where he is now and the reasons he's so conflicted. And so anyone who knows anything about anxiety or depression or madness, and I wrote another book about those exact things called Don't Let Them Get You Down, knows that what feels like that what you just described, to your point, John Shirley said something similar in regards to heroin addiction. I would say it's also very similar to someone who's going mad. It's a madness that is corrupting their mind. and that doesn't necessarily rooted in supernatural things. It could just be the fact that you're a human being, and human beings have a tendency to go mad in extreme situations. So yeah, so I hope, I like to think that the book has a lot of different levels. You could read it very much on its surface as a good versus evil book, or you could really, if you felt like taking a deeper dive in it, there was a lot of nuance to that book. And I do that a lot with my work, and I don't mean to pimp myself or put myself on any sort of pedestal, but it's important to me a lot of times to read that books can be read, or stories can be read, very much as a surface level narrative. Or if you want to go a little deeper, there are things in there that I put, like I wrote a story called Seraphina, which is the last story in Behold the Void. And you could read that story very much on the surface of what it is, and you could read how that story ends as very much of as a straight thriller, and this is how the thriller ends. Or you could go a little bit deeper and maybe reread the last 20 pages, and it might give you a different perspective on what happens. So I like to do that not all, in a lot of my work. Boys is one of those books where I really tried very, very hard. And actually, I had an early reader, very, very well-known author, I say, but because I want to, whatever, but it's not my place. But who said when they first read this book, in its very, very early form, that they're like, you want to be careful about, um, you want to really, I would emphasize, because he kind of knew what I was going for. He's like, I would emphasize more some of that ambiguity as to where the power is coming from on both ends of the spectrum, the good and the bad. And that was a really great comment too, because I was like, okay, I thought it was obvious, but it's obviously not. So I really went back and added a lot more introspection, as to, especially with Peter, um, as to what was happening with him and why he was able to do what he did to save the kids that he saved.
Awesome.
Against a very dark force.
Right.
Forces.
Well, and listen, the book leads to discussion, and that's
Yeah.
the mark of a good book. Cody and I had a nice talk about Boys in the Valley, slinging books at the heavy metal swap meet. So, we because I had read it more closely to when we were hanging out. And I think that's one of the things that's a sign of a really great horror novel, and one that you can think about, talk about, and dissect and get into. Philip, I think Boys in the Valley is one of the best books I read this year. It's a really powerful piece, and I think it's one that will worm in people's brains for a while, and it's some of those moments of really fine-tuned writing that just really bring it up. And you're right. Now, I did explain that I did say it in the context of demonic possession, but you're right. It could be madness as well, and that is definitely one of the things and about it. So, on that note, Boys in the Valley is coming out in paperback soon, right?
July.
July.
Yeah,
Okay.
a year. The book came out July 11th of 23, so the paperback will come out July 24. We're hoping to do. I'm hoping to do an alternate cover for the paperback. So we're in discussions with the publisher about that. Yeah, but that's when the paperback. Or if you're in the UK, it's a trade. It's a paperback original in the UK. So.
Okay. And one of the things I always like to recommend to my listeners is that there's a couple ways you can always support a book like this. You not only can buy it, if you don't have the money, you can request it at your library, and you should always request books at the library if they don't already have it, just as another way to support the writers. And of course, writing a review and spreading the word of mouth is really important. I have a tendency for books I like to face them out when I'm at Barnes and Nobles.
Oh yeah.
Like, and I sold at Only Good Indians the other day, with standing in Barnes and Nobles, because somebody was looking at Don't Fear the Reaper, and I just mentioned, hey, just so you know, that's book 2, and they didn't have My Heart Is a Chainsaw for whatever reason, and
Yeah,
I was able to sell the Only Good Indians to this person.
Steven's doing just fine, but yeah, it's good to have him go. I'm sure he's happy to have the sale.
Yeah, but I'm saying, like, these conversations are out there. You can have them with people too. Spread the word about these books. That really helps.
Yeah, I think more than anything, I think what's made this book, for the moderate success it's had, I think it's been more than I know it's been more than anything. It's been word of mouth, because it hasn't been reviewed in any major publication. It's not on any of the best of year list. It just really, it's just been kind of like very underground. But it's doing okay, and I think there's a lot of people talking about it and recommending it, and that's the most important thing to me, is that readers like it. And yeah, and to your point, tell your
Yep.
friend about it, or if there's someone you think who would be into it, like, yeah, buy him a copy.
And you should know that I do occasionally root for your Lions, because I think Jared Goff was done wrong by the Rams. I think they gave up on him too early. And I also don't have an NFL team anymore since the Chargers left, and they're dead to me now.
Get on the bandwagon, man. Jump on. There's room. Lots of room.
Yeah, well, I root for, I like underdogs, so a lot of times, and no matter how many games you guys win this year, the Lions are always going to be underdogs.
We're probably another 2 seasons from being, consistently great. I would say consistently great, a consistently upper tier team. I think this year we're like, this is our first, like, last, people don't realize last year we started 1-6.
Yeah.
Before that we were 3-13. Like, the fact that we have a winning record is like, everyone's like saying, oh, we're gonna go to the Super Bowl. It's like, no, we're not. Like, I'll be happy to win the division and go to the playoffs, but I think in a couple of years more, they're doing a good job building the team. The coach is amazing. And I think
Yeah.
I just love the
No one's
idea of being,
laughing at Dan Campbell now.
no one's laughing now. I love the idea of being consistently very good, because for I've been a Lions fan since I was a kid. So I'm an older guy. So 40 years now I've been following this team, and for 40 years they've been nothing but heartbreak. So the fact that we're actually competing and competitive and winning games and having winning records and stuff like that is exciting. Yeah, it's an exciting time. Like, it's funny, my son started enjoying, he's old enough now where he's starting to enjoy watching football with me. And he's like, I don't know why you're always like saying how bad the Lions are. They're pretty good.
How
Like,
they are,
kid,
yes.
this is the golden era you're coming into.
Right. All right. Well, how can folks find your work? Compiled all in one spot, probably
Yeah,
on
I'm on
website, right?
Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. Just search my name, and then I'm on my website is pfracassi.com.
Well, Philip, I love talking writing with you. We are very simpatico in a lot of our thoughts about narrative and research, and it's one of the reasons why I think I find your books very breezy and easy to read. I find I end up, my copy of Boys, even though it's a signed hardback, I've got all kinds of pages dog-eared where I'm like, ooh, that's good stuff.
Sweet.
And
Mark it up.
I
Mark it up.
appreciate
Make it
that.
yours.
And I super appreciate your attention to detail. It's one of the things that I like about your narrative. So, folks, one last thing I will say is that if you are anywhere near the Midwest, or you're wanting to watch this year's solar eclipse, the last solar eclipse in 2017, I went all the way to Carbondale, Illinois to watch it. It was the most amazing thing I ever saw in my life. And so my next science fiction novel is one called People's Park, and it takes place in my hometown of Bloomington, Indiana. And we are one of the best places in the country to watch next year's solar eclipse on Monday, April 8th. So on April 7th of this year, at Morgenstern's Books in Bloomington, Indiana, doing the book release party for People's Park. And then the next day you can hang out and watch the solar eclipse. And we are currently working on trying to get a Dickheads Philip K. Dick live event to record for the podcast that night there, since my other co-host lives in the Midwest, Professor David Wilson. So there might be 2 book events you could go to on the 7th in Indiana. The book release will be in the afternoon. The sci-fi event will be in the evening. One of the 2 of the greatest nerdy road trips you could do are in Indianapolis. By the way, the Ray Bradbury Center is in Indianapolis. They moved his whole office from Los Angeles to Indianapolis. You can go and see the books. They use pictures to put all of Ray Bradbury's books on the shelf exactly how he had it. You can sit in the chair where he wrote the Martian Chronicles, at the desk where he wrote everything but Fahrenheit 451, which he famously wrote in the Los Angeles Library. His desk, his chair, all of it. It's all, they recreated his office at the Ray Bradbury Center in Indianapolis. You want to go. The Kurt Vonnegut Museum is in Indianapolis. I'm giving you 4 nerdy things you can do outside of the solar eclipse in Indiana, and I suggest you do it. You don't have to do it with the solar eclipse, but if you want to go see the Ray Bradbury Center, Jason there, who's the Ray Bradbury expert, is awesome. They also have, if you plan it well enough, they have a VHS of the original cut of Something Wicked This Way Comes that was never released, the original director's cut. And they have been known to let people who visit the center go sit in a room and watch it. This is a rare thing. So I just want to put that out there that you can do that. So on that note, Philip, thank you for joining us. Sorry, you put up with my promotion. And I will see folks here again soon. I will have Philip back for his science fiction novel. I am positive. I will, I'm very much looking forward to it. And I'm probably, and what's the Civil War novel between there?
It's called Serafina.
Serafina. I'm looking forward to that one too.
Earthling Publications, September next year.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one too. But I gotta admit, the sci-fi one.
Yeah, that was... It'll be fun to have a sci-fi novel out there. I'm excited about it.
Yes. All right, folks. Thanks for listening. As always, keep it here. The next episode of this podcast will be the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, covering the second story from 1934, John W. Campbell's Twilight, with Alec Neville-Lee, the biographer of John Campbell, and Kate Hefner, who's a postgraduate student running her dissertation on science fiction fandom. So there's a lot of good discussion to be had. We'll see you then. Thank you, and thanks for joining us.